Our special guest today is Christine Cruzvergara. Christine serves as the Chief Education Strategy Officer at Handshake, leading their efforts to deepen partnerships with the higher education community to ensure greater and more equitable student career success. She is recognized as a change agent within the field of career education and is often referenced in national media, both domestically and internationally. She is the recipient of numerous innovation awards. But more importantly, she is well known in the profession for a seminal article she co authored on 10 future trends in college and career services, and her recent update on 5 future directions in university career services. She has a reputation of being a creative problem solver and organizational change agent, leading her teams to embrace and drive transformation. Christine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Christine, I'm wondering if we can jump right in. I'd like to hear about you and your journey with Handshake, especially as we've transcended COVID and we've navigated what I think to be one of the most impactful and frankly turbulent times, at least in my history so far, and for most Americans.
Absolutely. Let me start by telling everybody a little bit about Handshake for those that are unfamiliar. Handshake is the largest early career talent network. We help to connect over 1,400 universities and colleges, and there are 8 million active students and alumni with over 600,000 employers. And the whole mission of Handshake has always been to ensure that every learner, every student is able to start, restart, and jumpstart their career, regardless of where they went to school or who their families know. And this really stemmed out of a very problem that our founders had as students themselves, in realizing that while talent may be distributed evenly, access to opportunity is often not. And so that is how Handshake sort of came to be.
So, when I take a look at Handshake, I mean, do I have this right? We're talking 18 million students actively on the platform, thousands of institutions of higher learning, education and training institutions, and literally 600 plus thousand employers actively using it to recruit talent. Do I have those right, or have the numbers changed?
That is correct. No, those are our most recent numbers. The scale and the expansion of our network has been astronomical the past couple of years. And as you can imagine, with the pandemic, you mentioned COVID, there was a huge shift towards virtual. Before COVID hit in 2020, we were already seeing many employers shift towards a more virtual recruiting. And in large part, it was because they were trying to think about how do they actually diversify their candidate pools? How do they think differently about the next class of analysts or the next class of hires that they were bringing into their organization? What you saw with COVID was not necessarily a huge pivot for folks. It was an acceleration of a trend that was already happening. And so what would have probably taken 5 to 7 years of a slow trickle towards virtual got condensed down into about 5 months. And you saw everybody sort of flip on a dime and shift over to virtual. And as a result, people were able to see the real benefits that came out of doing virtual recruiting and what that meant in terms of their access to talent, in terms of students' access to opportunity, and the future of how they can advance their organizations.
We've spent a lot of time within the first and now the second Careers Institute and in general as we talk to college promise programs across the country in pulling the string as it pertains to the acceleration of the transformation of work, disruptions that were accelerated. They were already underway, as you say, but they were accelerated during COVID. We've seen the great resignation, right? We've talked about the impact disproportionately felt on women, on students that are also parents, on individuals that really have to balance these working priorities and responsibilities along with a very real reality of wanting a better future for themselves and their family through education. What are some observations that you, as a leader in Handshake, have really taken to heart through this process?
Well, the pandemic and the lasting effects, we're all reading every day in the news, the supply chain and all sorts of different complications that have come out of the pandemic. And those are quite devastating. You've noted them. As a college graduate, however, it is actually a really good time to begin your career. I know that sounds a little bit odd, difficult for those that were graduating in 2020, but the economy has actually rebounded much faster than people expected this year. And so when it comes to opportunity, the talent market right now has really accelerated, and folks are looking for very talented workers to begin working. You're seeing signing bonuses, you're seeing folks recruit in different ways, you're seeing the numbers really creep up. And so if you're working with college students, now is the time for folks to go after and really think about the types of opportunities that they want. And then I already mentioned this particular trend, but obviously I would be remiss if I didn't talk about virtual a little bit more. Recruiting is really huge, and you're certain companies. I'll give you a few examples. If you look at Microsoft or Ford, for example, they have decided that they're employing 100% virtual in terms of how they recruit folks. Plan on stopping that anytime soon, even coming out of the pandemic. So it's really critical that our institutions are thinking about how you prepare students to be ready for a virtual world of not only recruiting, but then a flexible and hybrid world for working. And that's very much what we are seeing in terms of the sort of future of work and the expectations of new workers. I would also add that another huge trend that we are seeing is this generation in particular really has high expectations around value and meaning. What is this organization about? What are they driving towards? Does this align with my values? DEI, of course, has been a hot topic, not only for employers and not only for institutions, but for the students of this generation that are looking for work, and for older generations that are looking to pivot in terms of their careers or industries. People are realizing, I think, through the pandemic, there's a lot more to life out there, and they want to better align their work and their values together. And so employers are telling us over and over again that they're getting harder questions from candidates around, what does this really look like? I don't want to just see what's on your website. I want to hear the real stories of the people on the ground in your organizations, and want to get a better sense of the culture and the inclusion or the lack thereof. And what are you doing to actually try and solve for some of those problems?
I think what you raise repeatedly is a hopefulness, right? A hopefulness, an opportunity. And sometimes, during chaos, I think folks, focus on the chaos, but I think the space has actually opened up with some really exciting opportunities to be able to better democratize, if you will, opportunity, and to be
That's
able
right.
to provide more and more Americans a pathway into their potential, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned you mentioned a topic that's very much on top of mind for our students, for our promise leaders. So I think for employers and the community at large, which is we've also been navigating, in addition to this public health crisis, a very real racial reckoning, right? A discussion around how do we navigate these structural inequities that in many cases have prevented mobility from happening for many of our students. Our students oftentimes say it is a Herculean effort to navigate education and training post high school. And then there is a tremendous amount of new complexity when it's time to now connect into career. Can you tell me a little bit about how Handshake is helping to close some of these inequities, but also working with employers, especially during their sourcing processes, to address issues like unconscious bias or just simply a lack of awareness as to diversity, equity, and inclusion in their practices?
Sure. The first way that Handshake is really helping to address this is at a systems level. So,
Mhm.
college recruiting, for those that have been in it for a long time or familiar with it, used to be a very closed system. And recruiters used to have to go individually, school by school by school, and they would have to have separate logins for each school's closed enterprise system, and they would have to post their job over and over and over and over again. As you can imagine, our poor recruiters don't have a lot of time, right? They also don't have a lot of resources. And when you have limiting how many places you recruit from, because you only have so much time to be able to post or to be able to a particular campus. And so many employers ended up with something called a core school model. And they would 20, 30, 50 schools that regularly go to and regularly recruit from. What Handshake did when we came onto the market to actually create a network. And we found a better way and an easier way to facilitate those connections. So now as a lawyer, you go into one platform, you go into Handshake, you post your position once, and instead you can actually post to all of the schools that you might want to be able to recruit from, where you see candidates that actually fit the criteria that you are looking for, or that might be interested in the geo that you are hiring for. And now you are actually able to find talent of institutions, hundreds of institutions at once. And you can actually be more inclusive about the skills and the criteria that you're looking for, rather than simply using school as a proxy for competence. And
So,
by doing, yeah, go ahead.
no, keep going. I'll save my question.
Okay. And so by doing that, we have seen employers really exponentially triple the types of candidates that are able to come through their pipeline, and to be able to recruit across multiple institutions, to be more school agnostic and rather focus on the skills and the competencies of these students and the candidates that they're looking for. So that has been really huge. Another piece that Handshake from a systems level has really been trying to tackle is the notion of social capital. And we can obviously talk even more about social capital in a little bit, but we all know that it does matter, and it is important who you know and how you build those connections. But the problem is many of our students don't come from families or don't come from communities where they already have that baked in. So they go to school and they come out and they don't have those connections. And you go to something like some of our other networking sites, intimidating because you don't have those connections. So you don't know who you should actually link with. On Handshake, we can actually help you build. So we have facilitated relationships. Students can meet their own peers at their institutions. They could meet peers at other institutions that may be the same student organizations, maybe in the same major, or maybe have the same interests as them. And they can also meet with recruiters. And so as employers post jobs, and also offer the opportunity to meet with a student and actually talk to them for 10 minutes about the culture of the organization. Now, think about how powerful that is if you're a first generation student, maybe you're a Pell Grant recipient, you haven't gone through this process, but it's already kind of nerve-wracking. You see a job that's interesting to you, and I might get to connect with Rosie, who's the recruiter, about the organization. I've now just humanized the process. I've put a name and a face together. And I think that alone makes a really big difference in helping folks to build the confidence and the social capital that's also needed to be able to make it to the next step. I know your second part of your question was around, are there certain recruiting practices that we sort of help employers think through? There definitely, 2020, we actually put out a small report to employers, letting them know that there are three particular that often disadvantage Black students in particular. And we wanted to call attention to this. So the first one was having an arbitrary GPA cutoff. Okay, many employers use it as the GPA cutoff. Now, if you think, though, about the history and the context of our country, social inequity then has had an impact on educational inequity. And so when you look at something like grades, that is not an indicator of capability. It is an indicator of wealth, and it's an indicator of what you access to. And so you have many students, many capable students, that actually are quite smart and can do the job, but they might be just below that 3.5 cutoff. And so by arbitrarily choosing that, you're actually eliminating quite a bit of your top of funnel in terms of the candidates. And so either or opening up the cutoff can be very helpful as employers are thinking about diversifying. The second, recognizing that a short recruiting window, and there's certain industries that are probably most guilty of tech, you look at finance, you look at iBanking, you look at consulting, they recruit in a very small window in the fall, about 6 weeks. Well, many of these students, many of our underrepresented students, many of our Black students have other obligations. They may be working part-time, they may be supporting their families, they may be juggling a lot of different other extracurriculars that they need to think about. And when they do that, they're not able to necessarily devote the time to have the best application, to get it reviewed by career services or by mentors or faculty or other folks, and they may end up not applying at all. And so by simply opening up your recruiting window to have more of an ongoing recruiting cycle, you again open up the opportunity for you to have more diverse candidates in your pipeline. And the last one is being transparent about salary. And so when you actually share entry-level salary ranges on a job description, you encourage Black students and Latinx students by 13% more to apply to your jobs. And it's something as simple as just being more transparent. If you have relocation costs that you're willing to cover, things like that go a long way to encouraging folks to actually apply for your positions. So those are a few examples of things that we have shared with them.
I think those are incredibly valuable and relevant, and they lead directly to my next question, which is finding that hardworking student and the fact that for many years we've overlooked the talent pool that resides in our community colleges across the country. We've talked a little bit about college promise from the context of helping to navigate transitions. Many of our promise students begin their journey in community colleges and successfully become four-year students soon after, right? And so we have this tremendous amount of, I think, lack of awareness when it comes to who is learning in our community colleges, the type of preparation and the potential that they really bring to employers. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about community colleges as part of your overall strategy? And are there any initiatives that you are thoughtfully engaging in to try and broaden the talent pool through sourcing through community colleges?
Yeah, I have to college pieces also very near and dear to my heart. As a daughter of two immigrants, my father went through community college in order to eventually get his bachelor's, and I saw him, young girl, taking one class at a time, and it took years through that process. And my own husband also is a community college graduate, and so just seeing the experience of two people in my life that I'm very clear the work ethic and the capability of folks that go through the community college pipeline, but there is somewhere a misunderstanding, I think, from employers or from general society around the capability and what that can really look like. So there's a few at Handshake we are really looking to do. We want to actually bring community colleges onto the platform. It is that community colleges had been asking us for some time, and we were not ready until this past academic year to officially open up to community colleges. Part of that was because we wanted to be intentional about our expansion. So in this past year, we've already added over 200 community colleges to the network, at about another 200 in this year. So we're very excited about the new partners that have joined us. One of the quotes I actually share with you stands out most from one of the big four consulting firms, accounting consulting firms. We were in an event about a year ago, and they said, it's not that we don't want to recruit from community colleges, it's that we don't have one central place to go to find the students. And from an employer's point of view, it was simply difficult to go into multiple different systems or to be able to figure out how they were supposed to find that talent. And that's, please let them onto Handshake to find four-year talent. We don't see two-year talent as that. It would be nice to one place and to be able to have access. And that was a huge turning point for us in recognizing that we had an opportunity to really change the narrative and change the tide here for communities. And so we're excited that now we can actually have community colleges on the network. We can make it easier for employers to find their students, and we can make it a lot easier for the community colleges to be able to give access to their students. I know, having worked in career education, even in the four-year space where resources are tighter at community colleges often. And from many of the partners that we talk to and work with, they rely on technology in order to be able to scale and to be able to meet the needs of students. And so we're excited that we're beginning to really build that journey with our two-year partners.
So, you raised a very important point, which is we've talked a little bit about agency, social capital, the opportunities to tap into community college and the talent and the wealth of experience of hardworking students that reside there. A lot of this begins upstream, right? With college counseling services and support, or opportunities while in a community college or four-year with career services. There are some challenges, are there not, with regards to the quality and the calibration of services that are provided across the board? And if we're really going to get at some of the structural inequity, don't we have to do more in that space? I mean, it feels like part of the investment needs to begin at the source of that initial conversation, that influence point. What are your thoughts? And I'm pulling on your vast experience, not only as a provost, right, of at Wellesley and other, environments, but you've written about this extensively. You have a lot of thoughts around this and solutions. I'd like to talk about that a little bit in this context.
Sure. Rosie, how much time do you have? I have a lot of thoughts. I will start by saying, first and foremost, we have to look at the solution from a structural perspective, not from a programmatic perspective. What I mean by structural is thinking about the type of leader you're hiring, the tables that leader is going to sit at, and the types of systems or structures at your particular institution that you have put in place to ensure that the students who are most likely to fall through the cracks don't the cracks. At most institutions, 2-year or 4-year, the only thing that is actually required of a student is class. It's the academic piece of the experience. And that is important, but we have to ask, with the changing demographic of the students that are coming through our doors going to college, our survey that we've done, and we've also looked at surveys that Gallup and Strata have done, over 80% of students, 90% of students, report that the reason they go to college is for social and economic mobility, to get a better job. That is a reality. Then it would be a false dichotomy for us to say, well, college is just for learning, for us to build enlightened citizens. It is, but it doesn't have to be at the exclusion of career preparation, to ensure that our students are able to be successful once they walk out of college, to be able to pay back the loans that they've taken to get this education. And so I would love to see more institutions formally integrate career preparation into the academic curriculum. And that could take a lot of different forms. That could be in the form of some required career classes, so that students have to actually reflect on what their values are, what their strengths are, their areas of growth, my resume, how to navigate online virtual recruiting, how to connect and network, how to apply, how to negotiate, right? These are some basic life skills that all of us have had to use multiple times. Most students are never formally taught this. They have to pick it up. Now, our most affluent students typically pick it up from their families. Our less affluent students, where do they get it from? And so as educational providers, isn't it our responsibility to think about how do we build that into the system so that they don't have to go searching for it? Because if you don't know, you sometimes don't know what questions to ask. And so perhaps we should build it into the system so that it is just there for them and they can take advantage of it, they can learn it, and then they will know other questions to be able to ask. So I think the integration or the requirement of career prep into the academic experience, whether through career courses or through integrating in some of the actual curriculum of the discipline, is really important. And I think things like connecting faculty pedagogy to the skills that students are learning is a really easy way to involve faculty without asking faculty to take on the mantle of having to know all of career preparation. So if you were to be, let's say, an English professor, and you were teaching a literature class, and one of the projects you have is for analysis and then a verbal presentation on a particular literary work that they've just had, having you for 30 seconds to your class, why them do that analysis and that presentation, that it's helping them with their verbal presentation skills, with their ability to succinctly synthesize and understand themes, and then to apply it to another situation. Those are skills that you will use much any job you have, but that connection, unless a faculty member or an administrator helps them to make that connection. And those types of things are important. I also think that resourcing, it doesn't always come money. Do many of you need more staff? 100%. But if you don't have that, at least make sure that your leaders is sitting at tables and asking to other leaders who have influence on campus that you are at, so that they can help places where career prep can truly be plugged, integrated, and really designed so that are able to get that. And then lastly, it gets really important for institutions to think about ability and measurement outcomes. So how do you want to define that success? Andy Chan, my colleague who's at Wake Forest, and I wrote a paper recently in collaboration with many college leaders, some at the 2-year space, outcomes that matter, outcomes and metrics that matter. And we take our first pass at beginning to propose some of the types of metrics that institutions probably want to look at in order to determine, am I on the right track? Am I on the right page? And how do we continue to move this path and strengthening that we have? So Rosye, that I could literally talk about this forever, but I will stop right there and let you follow up.
What you're saying resonates very deeply with me. Prior to working with College Prom, I spent a lot of my times in support of transitioning military and military families. And one of the big pilots that the government ran looked at career exploration for transitioning military. And we tracked the data. It was a great public-private partnership where we really aligned what types of exploration was taking place. And what we found is, by and large, most veterans had about 10 jobs consistently that they explored when job seeking or exploring, or less. And they were really, you don't know what you don't know, right? And I think, we find that so often is, how are we weaving the emerging and available job markets, the local trends, that information about career exploration into day-to-day experiences, not only on campus, but in the ecosystem of the student. And oftentimes when you read the data, you see first-gen students who complete either their program of study or 2- and 4-year degree, committing to a job and being in an underemployment type of situation. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of knowledge as to what is possible. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how can we collectively do better? Because this is I think an area that's often overlooked, which is, how do we grow this acumen of just exploration and knowing, and kind of closing the gap on the unknown of the new jobs that are hitting the market right now that didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago.
That's right. So there are a few different things we can actually do together. I think one actually dovetails with your previous question, which is in institutions and sort of what needs to change. The biggest things is recognizing that the world around us has changed, and therefore our service has to change. And we have to recognize that students actually already have to a lot of things on sort of the open, if you will. And so the notion of trying to control is not one that is going to allow any institution to be successful. Instead, you want to think about your role as evolving into being a connector or a convener. Students have access to a lot of these things. You trying to control will be futile. Instead, think about who are the relations or the value prop that you have, and how can you help students get connected to professionals in some of these new fields, so that they are able to learn about what is changing rapidly, because I promise you it's changing faster than the sector of education, generally speaking. And I say that with all affection because I love education, but all of the other industries are changing at a more rapid pace. And so for us, for anyone working in education, it's critical that to connect students to the people who are actually in those fields so that they can hear directly from them. These are the types of jobs that are coming. These are the types of skills that we're looking for. This is what's going to make you a competitive candidate. That's one. The second is really thinking about skills. And this is an area where I think both Handshake has opportunity in the future, as well as higher education institutions, especially 2-year colleges. We've heard a lot about stackable credentials. That's not a term that I think is new to anyone on the line today. And what we make is actually build another marketplace that really allows students, as they're looking for jobs and exploring, to be able to see, oh, okay, I kind of meet most of the qualifications here, but it looks like I'm perhaps missing 1 or 2 that keeps popping up for the types of jobs that I'm looking for. Maybe I need to go get that. Okay, great. I click. All of these different providers provide short-term, last-mile skill building for that particular skill. Great. There's some free options. There's some paid options. I'll choose the one that sort of works for me. I can do that. That gets popped into my profile on Handshake, easily findable. by employers who are looking for that particular skill set. That's a vision and a dream that we are very much working towards as we 2022 to make it easier, because I understand for many students, the skills landscape is very fragmented and it's hard for them to even know where to go or where to look or who to trust in terms of the right information. And at Handshake, with the set we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, sitting on so much data, we want to use that data for good, to be able to surface those types to our educational partners and to our students. Now, on the education side, this is where I think the speed and agility of many two-year colleges is necessary. And this is where community colleges can lead the way as we head into the future. Making sure that you are staying not only open to the feedback that you're hearing from industry, whether it's coming from folks like Handshake or it's coming directly from your Chamber of Commerce or coming directly from the employer partners that you have. Listen and be open to the skills that they are looking for and build the classes and the curriculum and the coursework in conjunction with employers to actually help your students position themselves for those types of opportunities. There's so many two-years that I feel like I've spoken to that are excited about that, have already been doing that for many years and are excited to accelerate that even more. I would love to see our four-year partners jump the same way that our two-year partners have done. But I think there's an opportunity for acceleration.
You talked a little bit about the data that Handshake gets to sit on top of, or really kind of coordinate within its umbrella. The audience that's here today really is cut across different sectors, industries. It's not all concentrated in the education space. We have a lot of employers and nonprofits, intermediaries. Can you share some data that you feel is relevant to our audience today that could help them maybe take that next step in the journey? All of our folks are change makers, but how can any information that could accelerate what's already underway?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to actually go back to one of the points that I made earlier. I'll share some data related to this around virtual. So we know that students, this generation in particular, would really like to see more virtual components as recruiting experience. And there's a number of ways they say that. So 71% of students actually say that virtual events, for example, are far less intimidating for them. And you see that number even higher when you look at women and students of color. So especially for the employers that are on the line today, many of you, I don't think I've met a single employer in the past year and a half that has not had DEI as one of their core sort of priorities for their organization. If you are genuinely concerned about that, you need to be genuinely concerned about the modalities in which you are engaging students. In-person events can be really great for some of your majority students. But for many of your non-majority students that you are trying to tap into, you have to think about virtual. It's allowed them to feel more seen, especially Black candidates and Latinx candidates. Over 65% of Black students said that they felt more seen in a virtual event, and that led them to more likely apply for your job, right? More than 65%. That's huge. And so recognize why that might be. We've seen actually in a recent New York Times article that many Black employees were reporting that they actually are hoping for more remote work or hybrid work, even as we emerge out of the pandemic, because sometimes being in person means that you have to deal with things like microaggressions. And that's exhausting on a day by day, hour by hour sort of experience. You're not only trying to perform in your job, but then you also have to deal with these small microaggressions that, quite frankly, when they add up, don't feel so small anymore, right? And so now think about students who are new to this process, who are looking to be hired by many of your organizations. When they're in a large networking event or a large fair, for example, they feel like they have to jockey for space and time, right? And if you are thinking about a neurodiverse student or a student who's more introverted or a student who is more shy, they might be able to better present themselves when they know that they have 10 minutes of allotted time with you to be able to talk and engage in a real conversation, right? I think those are really important. When you look at virtual interviews in particular, it's very interesting to see that 55% of women prefer a virtual interview compared to 41% of men. right? So again, you see this split between the majority and the non-majority in some of these numbers. And I think that's particularly insightful. Now, one of the things I thought was most interesting was about social capital. So in building social capital, this particular generation, Generation Z, is has very hopeful, to go back to your word, Rosie, about the prospects of career and what that means for them. Over 70% of them all believe that it is easier for them to make connections and to break into the industry that they're interested in than it was for their parents' generation. And in large part, it is because of technology, because technology has allowed them to break down some of the barriers to be able to actually meet people. And so one of the things that I thought was most interesting was that, again, women and students of color are 1.7 times more likely than their white male counterparts to believe that it is better and easier for them to begin to build those relationships virtually. And women were almost, I think, 20 percentage points higher than men in believing that you can build strong relationships completely virtually. And so these are the types of findings that I think are really fascinating. If you're interested, you can look at all of our Handshake network trends. We have a landing page. I can share that with Rosie to send out to the group afterward. And you can get all of the details from the 3 different reports that we had this past year. But I just highlighted a few of the top stats that I think are most interesting. And the main takeaway is that for women and for students of color, think about the different ways that you are engaging them so that you don't actually lose them through the process.
We will be putting those resources in our resources section on our platform. So thank you so much for pointing folks in that direction. We'll make sure that it's up and available for folks. Before we pivot to some Q&As that have been coming in, I want to talk a little bit about our first generation professionals. And this is a population, I think, very near and dear to both of us, right? I'm first generation American. Your story about your parents certainly mirrors my own, and the role that community colleges played really in allowing them to punch into the middle class and beyond, right? And how critical those resources are. We listen to our first gen professionals routinely talk about their challenges in not understanding a lot of the norms and expectations that are required of them when they enter the workforce, that those are not necessarily skills that they were able to develop and flex while they were pursuing their program of study. And I think it's a very vulnerable place for many of our first gen professionals to admit to, which is, I literally don't understand the terminology, the taxonomy, the culture, and I don't have a network, as you mentioned, to really help me understand that, right? How are you finding these opportunities, or in working with employers, how we can address some of these challenges, right? I mean, obviously, you talk a little bit about what can we do earlier up the pipeline, upstream, right, to be able to introduce some of these lessons and some of these observations. But we still have an incredible amount of student or returning workers that find themselves stuck or unable to fit, right? And I hear these terms repeatedly by first gen workers of, I'm a low status worker, or I'm not necessarily a worker that has, that fits in. I don't understand their culture. I come from a different, socioeconomic status. What are some observations, advice, or thoughts that you would present to them?
Sure. I'm going to share a few things with you, both from not only the vantage point of my position at Handshake and what I'm hearing across the board, but honestly, personal experience and personal advice that I myself have had to employ to be successful. I think one of the first things that any organization can do is to make the implicit explicit. And I guarantee you have at least a few people in your organization right now that would be happy to point out for you what needs to be more explicit. And so if you are unsure, go to your folks in some of your ERGs or some of your underrepresented folks and ask them, what was hard about the transition coming into your organization? And what I mean by that are, there are social norms, there's terminology and lingo, and there are professional norms that essentially are the 3 buckets that most people need to understand in order to be successful in an organization. And as a first gen student who may not have been exposed to some of these things, For someone who is very used to it, you might think, oh, well, this is just normal. People obviously talk about skiing and going to Tahoe on the weekends. And then professionally, everybody knows that we're going to do 2x2s when we're trying to organize our thoughts for a leadership meeting. And we're going to have a briefing for this, and this is how you format it. Those are not things that most people know. Those are things that have to be taught. And so make sure that you actually document in your organization what that means. One of the things that was incredibly helpful to me at Handshake when I transitioned from higher ed into tech, there was so much lingo and jargon and acronyms that I did not understand when I first started. And one of the first things the co-founder did for me was they created a tech lingo channel on Slack. And every time an acronym was used, somebody would pop it into the Slack channel and they would define it so that I could start to learn some of those. We have since obviously expanded our team exponentially. We've hired many more people from nonprofits, from education, from other places. And that channel has served to be very, very helpful for folks so that they can go back and they can see a record of, okay, ACV means this and ARR means this and BOD means this and so on and so forth. So make the implicit explicit and do that within the norms of your organization. The other thing that I think is really important is to keep in mind that sometimes social conversations, while it may be the norm for a lot of people, can actually feel not inclusive for other folks, right? So, for example, I used to work at an organization that I would define some of the peers that I was with as sort of the good old boys club. And they were really into sports and really into athletics. And every time I walked into a meeting, we would spend the first 15 minutes talking about the latest game, regardless of what sport it was. We would talk about the latest game, we talk about the players, we talk about how it went. And I have to tell you, it was hard because I had nothing to add to that conversation. I'm not particularly into sports. I sometimes know what season or what sport is playing, but otherwise didn't have a whole lot to contribute. And I don't know that, and at the time I was a very young professional, I don't know that any of my colleagues at the time ever thought about, oh, wow, maybe not everybody's into this. And this particular conversation topic actually isn't so inclusive of folks, right? Same for when you're talking about big or expensive trips that you might be going on. It might not seem like anything for you to go off to Tahoe for 4 days to go skiing or to go to New York or to go to Miami. But for some people, that's a lot of money and they can't do that and they can't send their families off to do that. And the idea of taking a trip is perhaps something that they have to really save up for an entire year just to go on one trip, right? So I think, again, keeping in mind that some of those topics might not always be the most inclusive. And so in sharing who you are, you might also want to ask others what they do. How was their weekend? How do they like to engage? I'm not suggesting that folks who have privilege not be able to talk about or share some of the experiences that they have, but to just be more thoughtful in recognizing that you might want to expand your question set to include things that will make others also feel like what they're doing is also okay and is also welcomed in this particular environment.
I think that's even more important for the 3 million women that have left the workforce, right? Because, for many of them, they had significant responsibilities exacerbated by COVID, both whether it's mothering, caregiving, or simply head of household and health issues that they had to navigate. And so reentry for them, I think, is going to be very important because there is certainly a big divide between that trust factor and that inclusivity of wanting to have a teammate that can fully engage and potentially share of themselves, right? And we've seen, we've lost this incredible talent by the millions that we hope to get back in, right?
Yeah, I love that you brought this up actually, because one of the examples I was going to use was the types of questions you ask women versus men. So I'll give you a very personal example. I have an 8-year-old son. My best friend, who is a male, has also an 8-year-old son, born 3 months. And when we both went back to work, we went to a conference. And I noticed for a solid year and a half, he noticed as well, that the types of questions he would get from colleagues and the types of questions I would get from colleagues were very different, even though we both had sons that were exactly the same age and we came back to work at exactly the same time. The questions I would get would often be, or I'm sorry, the questions he would get would often be, how's your son? Do you have any pictures? What's he doing these days? Is it exciting? What are you learning? What's it been like to be a father, right? Those types of questions. The questions I would regularly get would be, oh, wow, you're here at the conference. It must be so hard to be away from your son. Do you miss him? Who's watching him right now? Right? Like, think about the difference in those types of questions. We're both at the same conference. We're both taking time away from our families, right? But the connotation behind those questions are drastically different. And it sends a message to me as a female and as a woman leader that perhaps I should feel more guilty for what it is I am doing and the time that I am spending away. Whereas nobody at all questioned what my friend's experience was sort of like in that way. And so when you think about your parental leave policies and you think about the types of questions, every single one of us can do this. Make sure that you're being inclusive and that you're asking that. I recently had a direct report come to our extended leadership retreat just a couple weeks ago. And one of the first questions I asked him was, this is your first trip away from your son. Has it been hard? Like, you haven't spent 4 days away from your son, right? And he's like, oh my God, thank you for asking. It is actually kind of hard, and he's like, but you're the first person that's actually asked me that. So just make sure that you're thinking about those types of things, because we do want more women to feel like they belong and that they are able to actually contribute, because the reality is they just need understanding and to feel like what they're doing is not out of the norm.
And the best way of being able to make a lot of these advancements are to be seated at the table. So we want to bring them back because they're needed, their voice is needed at the table to continue to make to ensure progress continues.
We've got add real quick. One of the things that we saw in one of our reports is that for Z women to want to work in an organization, they want to see more women in leadership. So if you want to actually recruit more women, start advancing the women that are actually in your organization and think about what that looks like.
Well, this is a topic I could have a whole other hour conversation, because that means advancing them beyond glass cliff opportunities, right? That means truly advancing them in meaningful ways that show they've got agency and power and they're able to be similarly situated. I think 100% with you on that. We have a couple of questions from the audience. You've hit on a couple as they pertain to first-gen students and as it pertain to women and women coming back to work. But we had another question that said specifically, are there tactical recommendations that you would speak to educators or institutions of higher learning as it pertains to helping to bolster the career outcomes of students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things is make sure that you are actually partnering with your technology partner, because I would venture to guess most every educational institution that is listening right now and not listening right now does not have the resources or the people power of having a staff that is big enough to actually reach every single student in your student body. So first and foremost is make sure you are partnering with your technology partner, whether that is Handshake or somebody else, to ensure that you have strategy to actually scale your reach. The average number, I believe this was through Gallup, the average number of sort of student body that most schools are able to serve through their career center is usually about 35%, okay? 30 to 35%. That means you have 65 to 70% of your student that is potentially not touched by the career center. So you have a couple of different options here. One is to then use technology to reach the other 65 to 70%, okay? And know that for the most part, at least something is better than nothing. The other option is to think about how do you redesign your roles in your center to think about how you will actually expand that goal for a school that's currently at 30%. Maybe your goal next year should be to hit 50% of your student body. And you might have to actually change the way and the structure in which you have organized your positions to do that. One of the things, I'll give you an example that I've often thought about, having now had industry experience, and if I were to ever go back to education, is to actually think about my advisors with a very different profile. If I actually set up my advisors as sort of, if you will, almost like a sales pipeline with our students, and thought about our students as a caseload or a book of business that we were trying to meet, and we had them in different stages. For those that have been in sales, you're familiar with the different sales stages. And your goal in sales is to move somebody from one stage to another stage to another stage. And at any given point, I could do a pipeline review with you and know exactly where all of your books are, where all your business is. Exactly. That would be pretty awesome if you could actually do that with your students. And if you knew, Rosie, for your book of business with your caseload of 4,000 students, or however many students you have, you know at least where they all are in terms of what stage. Now, some of you are sitting there thinking, Christine, that's not possible. We just don't have enough people to be able. The question becomes, how do you get more creative? You're probably not going to be able to meet one-on-one with all of them. Could you group events? Could you do a survey? Could you with faculty? Could you partner with Res Life? Could you find a different way in order to get some of that information? That's what I mean about systems. Maybe every single student has to go through the registrar in order to sign up for classes. Maybe as part of that, they also need to sign up for Handshake and create their profile, and they need to be able to indicate on their profile or somewhere what stage they're in. And that would give you insight into that, right? So examples, tactical examples of how someone might think a little bit differently about the work that we're currently doing.
Christine, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been a fabulous conversation, extremely helpful. I look forward to continuing our conversations as you continue to do more work within the Promise community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was such a joy to be here with all of you.